Haven't seen in ages. Hey. Good. All right, so I have this very, very special candle holder in front. The congregation can see it. We can see it. Who knows what this is?
A menorah.
I heard it. A menorah. Raina, I'm glad that you know. It's a menorah. And what is a menorah used for?
To hold candle.
Well, let's give someone else a chance, Raina. Go for it. To hold candles. During what time of year? During Hanukkah, yes, during the Jewish Festival of Lights. So the story that I want to tell you is about how this menorah, with its 8 candle holders and one for the special helper candle, how it came to be a very, very long time ago. Now, our stories usually, the stories that we tell here are usually from a long time ago. And I was wondering, why don't we tell stories from the future? Well, it turns out it's kind of hard to tell stories from the future because they haven't happened yet. But maybe one day we'll be able to hear a story from the future. Today, our story is from the past, and maybe it'll help us in the future. So a very, very long time ago, far, far away, there were a group of people, the Jews, who lived a very peaceful existence, and they worshiped in their very, very special temple in Jerusalem. And they had a king who was very far away that allowed them to worship in their temple named Alexander. Now, Alexander eventually died, as sometimes happens to people, and a new king came to power, and his name was Antiochus. And Antiochus was convinced that the Jews should no longer worship their one God in their temple in Jerusalem, but rather should worship the many, many gods of the Greeks. Now, the Greeks had a god for the sun, a god for the moon, a god for the water, even a god for partying. They had many, many gods, and they thought that all of their gods should have a place in the Jerusalem temple. Now, the Jews were really, really upset by all of this because they had for centuries worshipped their one God. And their one God was very special to them, and they didn't want to worship these new and foreign gods. So many of the Jews rose up and tried to protest and tried to fight against Antiochus and his powerful, powerful army, which was all around Jerusalem and all around the surrounding countryside. But the Jews were overwhelmed, so many of them had to flee high into the mountains and live there for a very, very long time. Now, there was a leader among them whose name was Mattathias. Mattathias was part of this resistance who wanted to fight to have their temple be preserved for the one God that they had always worshipped. Now, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit by saying that in their temple, where worship was devoted to one God, they had a lamp that was lit at all times. And the lamp looked a little bit like this. It was lit by oil. Now, when the Greek gods were added to the temple, they stopped lighting the lamp. So anyways, high in the mountains, Mattathias and his 5 sons fought for a very, very, very long time. Eventually, Mattathias, he died, and his son, named Judah, took over. Now, Judah was a really, really, really strong warrior. In fact, he was so strong that many people called him the Hammer. Like the hammer, right? Really strong. Now, they didn't call him the Hammer because that's an English word, and they weren't speaking English back then. They called him Maccabee because Maccabee is the old Aramaic word that means hammer. So he was like a hammer. And he trained the soldiers to work really, really hard, and they got really, really disciplined. And eventually, they did go up against Antiochus's army. And even though they were outnumbered, and in some ways outskilled, they still managed to defeat Antiochus and his army. So the army left Jerusalem. They had come down off the mountains, and then eventually they drove them out of Jerusalem, and they went into the temple that used to be devoted to the worship of the one God, and they found that the temple was in ruins, absolute ruins. Right? The soldiers didn't leave anything in order. Everything was just upside down. And a lot of people were discouraged. They were like, oh my goodness, our beautiful temple is a mess. It's an absolute mess. But Judah, the Maccabee, said, you know what? We can't give up. Let's try to rebuild. And in time, they were able to clean up the temple and get it into proper order. And the last thing that they were going to do was to light the lamp. So they looked all over the temple to see if they could find oil for the lamp. They looked in the various rooms and in the courtyards and under the stones, and they could only find one jug of oil. And everyone just was really upset, filled with despair. One jug of oil, that's barely going to last us one day. But Judah said, you know what? Let's have faith. Let's light our candle because we're so glad to be back in our temple, the one that we fought really hard to get back so that we could believe the way that we want to believe. Let's just have faith and let's light the menorah with the oil that we have. So they lit the menorah, and the light stayed on for the whole of one day, and then the next, and then the next. And some people even say that the light grew brighter as the days went on, until finally the menorah was lit for 8 whole days, 7 more days than it was supposed to last. And Judah said, you know what? This is a really special kind of thing that's happened, a really unexpected thing. We should try to remember this event every single year. So that's why around this time of year, Jews all over the world light the menorah to celebrate that special event, that Hanukkah that happened thousands of years ago. And Unitarian Universalists honor that tradition because it reminds us how important it is to stand up for what we believe, and to do that at all costs. And that sometimes, even though we're a small group of people, probably as small as the Maccabees were in their mountain hideouts, even a small group of people can make a very big difference if they stand up for what they believe. Can you remember that? I think you can. So now I invite our congregation to sing the words printed in your order of service as we go off to our Sunday school class.